Michigan State University College of Law, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our third Dean Speaker of the Year in our fourth annual Dean Speaker Series. I'll have much to say about our guest, Ash, in a moment, but first I wanted to thank everybody who was involved in planning this event, including our Associate Dean for Faculty and Intellectual Life, David Blankfein-Tabachnik, and in the Dean's Suite, my assistant, Kelly Mell, Sonia Hernandez, who's the Executive Assistant to the Associate Deans, and also I wanted to thank Margie Amory, who does a wonderful job putting this event together and bringing in our guests, and our communications department led by Aaron Richards. And also, finally, of course, IT, led by Allison Virag McCann. I think I see him back. Thank you. So, thank you all for all of your help. So let me introduce our speaker today, Ashutosh Bhagwat, who goes by Ash. He's the Bookover and Bird Endowed Chair for the Study and Teaching of Freedom and Equality at the University of California, Davis School of Law. He is the author of The Myth of Rights, published by Oxford University Press in 2010, and Our Democratic First Amendment, published by Cambridge in 2020, as well as numerous other books, book chapters, articles, and essays on a wide variety of subjects. His scholarship over the past 2 decades has focused almost exclusively on free speech. His articles have appeared in Yale Law Journal, the Supreme Court Review, the California Law Review, the Administrative Law Review, and many others. Prior to joining the faculty of UC Davis, he taught at UC Hastings College of Law, just about an hour or so away, as I learned this morning. And there he was awarded the Rudder Award for Teaching Excellence. Ash is a summa cum laude graduate of Yale University, where he received his BA in honors in history, and the University of Chicago Law School, where he served as articles editor of the Law Review there. He then completed clerkships, 2 clerkships, first with Judge Richard Posner of the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, whose son is actually coming next week to visit us at a symposium with the Law Review, and then on to clerk for Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Anthony Kennedy. After clerking, he practiced for a bit at Sidley and Austin in Washington, D.C., and he is currently an editor, executive editor of the Journal of Free Speech and a member of the American Law Institute. So please join me in welcoming Ash to Michigan State University.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So before we get started, I just want to let everybody know who hasn't been here before, we've left note cards on your seats, or on the tables in front of you. Please use them if you want to write down questions during the talk. We will have time at the end. Pass them to the end. So our Associate Dean will pick them up, and then he will ask the questions. He may group them, organize them a little bit based on time and what we're able to cover, so we get through them all and have the most productive conversation with the time available to us. So I'd like to begin by asking you how you came to pursue this line of research. Why is free expression and democracy so important, and particularly important to you?
So it's funny, this has been my obsession for a very long time. My Law Review note in 1989, I wrote on free speech and democracy. So it's been a career-wide obsession. But when I was clerking in the Supreme Court, I got to...
Uh-oh.
When I was clerking on the Supreme Court, I got to...
Let me see if I can turn mine off. Apparently we have too many mics going.
There we go.
Perfect.
So when I was clerking on the Supreme Court, I ended up working on a couple of free speech cases, and that added to my interest. And then when I practiced law, I was actually a telecommunications lawyer. And this is in a period in which the internet is in its infancy, and kind of the Bell system is broken up, and lots of things are going on. And cable television was really rising during this period. And so my first law review article was about as a professor was about cable television and the First Amendment. So this has been something I've always been interested in, both because I find how free speech law deals with new technology, or doesn't in some cases, fascinating. And also because I think free speech obviously is essential to democracy, as you know, for obvious reasons.
Yeah. Well, and as technology continues to evolve, you will never be out of new forms of technology to address, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is it's a changing game constantly, because even when we think that social media is the end all, we thought that was true of newspapers 300 years ago, right? I mean, it's not. It won't be.
Yeah. So the title of our talk is The War on Social Media. So what do you mean by the war? Who's waging it, and how is it being fought?
So the way I see it, there are two aspects to the war, and obviously it's a slightly inflammatory way of describing it, but one is rhetorical and the other is legal. The rhetorical aspect of it comes a lot from journalists, but also from politicians, and an inclination to blame anything they don't like about our society on social media. And I can use examples from the political right and left, because I think it's very even in that respect. But there's a tendency to, for example, blame political polarization on social media. The data's not there. The data quite clearly shows that social media's contribution to polarization is not zero, but relatively minor compared to other things. They like to blame things like the mental health crisis among children, which we can talk more about later, on social media. Again, maybe some impact, but certainly the role of social media is exaggerated. And on and on and on. There's just this tendency on the part of certain elements because social media is how we communicate today, there's a tendency to see everything as being caused by the medium rather than those who are using it, which I think is problematic. And the other side of the war is the legal war, which is the fact that after a long hiatus, we are increasingly aggressively regulating social media. This is most obvious in Europe with the Digital Services Act, which came into effect a couple of years ago, which is really a wholesale, cradle-to-grave regulation of how social media operates in ways which would be blatantly unconstitutional if tried in the United States. But in addition, there's the TikTok law, there's the laws that Florida and Texas passed in 2021 in response to the deplatforming of President Trump in January of that year. And California has passed a raft of statutes in the last couple of years, most of which are in litigation currently. So there's all of a sudden, after a 10-year in the United States period of hands-off, there's very much a feeling that things are moving. And there are dozens of bills in Congress pending on regulating social media as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned TikTok. TikTok is probably the kind of most pressing battle in the war, I guess, at this point. So TikTok exploded on the scene during the pandemic, connecting creators and influencers and starting these viral trends in music, fashion, art, kind of creating these short videos which are like catnip for viewers, right? They have almost 1.6 billion active users each month on the platform as of today, or at least as of last week. That was the fifth most monthly active users of any social media platform, including Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Those are the only ones who were ahead of TikTok. And in 2022, TikTok had the most downloaded entertainment app worldwide. Right? So that's ahead of Netflix, which was second, which generated 165 million downloads compared with 672 million downloads by TikTok. So a little over a week ago, right, a law that was banning TikTok went into effect after the Supreme Court upheld its constitutionality, right? And the site briefly went dark, flickered back to life after President Trump said he would issue an executive order to stall the implementation of the law. And he issued that executive order, one of the flurry that were issued last week. And there may be, I hear yesterday, a buyer, maybe. So who knows what's happened since I last looked at the news. This one is moving so fast. So walk us through this. What is this law about? Why did they ban TikTok in the U.S., and what was the challenge to that law?
So I should start by saying a group of us law professors filed an amicus brief in both the DC Circuit and the Supreme Court, siding with TikTok. So I'm not a neutral player here, but I have no financial
Thank you
interest.
for the
It's just my
disclaimer.
But so the TikTok law was passed about 9 months ago, and bipartisan in Congress, signed by President Biden. And it's technically not a ban, though we think it is a ban. And what it says is within 9 months after enactment, which is to say last weekend, unless TikTok has found a US buyer, it has to go, basically, it's not even it has to go dark, but American companies cannot provide services anymore, which effectively means it has to go dark. And the terms of the required sale were complicated. And all of the background to this is TikTok is owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company, private Chinese company, but the concerns underlying it were that Chinese companies, which is true, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government have a lot of ways to influence and control Chinese companies. And so there were national security concerns raised, and they really fell into two buckets. One bucket was data, that TikTok is hoovering up the data of all of these Americans, and it should be emphasized, well, TikTok may not, even in the United States, there are 170 million regular users of TikTok, and TikTok, as we all know, leans young. Facebook is for old people, TikTok is for young people, basically.
How many people use TikTok in the room? Okay, yeah.
And the concern was that all of this data would be gathered and then would be stored and would be accessed by the party and be used in ways to sort of influence or manipulate people. The other concern, which I think was the real concern, was about manipulation. So the algorithm that drives what videos pop up on your TikTok app is owned by ByteDance. And it's proprietary, and basically TikTok has some control over it, but it's primarily a ByteDance algorithm. And the concern was that in a moment of crisis, first of all, the concern is even now, maybe the algorithm is being used to serve up content that is pro-Chinese, anti-Taiwan, or, and this concern was actually expressed on that floor of the Congress, too pro-Palestinian, not pro-Israeli enough during, obviously, the Gaza war. But the further concern was imagine there was a crisis, say China attacks Taiwan. That concern was the algorithm would be used to sort of twist or influence the content that young users saw to sort of tell China's sort of story and kind of to draw questions about the accuracy of the US government story. So those were the two concerns.
And what was the constitutional challenge to this law specifically?
It was First Amendment. The basic argument was that TikTok is a US company. It has First Amendment rights. TikTok users, both content providers and viewers, have First Amendment rights. ByteDance does not. Everyone concedes that it's not a US entity. And that especially these concerns about manipulating content, and we're falling into doctrine here, but under First Amendment law, content-based regulations of media are subject to strict scrutiny, which means they're not automatically struck bound, but it means the burden is on the government to provide proof that the national security threat that's alleged is real and in some sense, and there's no other way of addressing the problem. And that was the thrust of the First Amendment argument. And I'll just continue. The Supreme Court upheld the law 9-0, and the DC Circuit upheld the law. DC Circuit opinion I'm going to ignore, it's not important anymore. But basically what the majority of the court said is we're going to ignore these content moderation concerns. We're just going to focus on data privacy, and we think the data privacy concern is not a content-based concern, which is correct, I think. And we think there's enough here that you survive constitutional scrutiny. My problem with that is I think the data privacy argument is a smokescreen. The amount, this is just, I mean, many of you I think know this, the amount of personal data about American social media users that is sold in the markets by data brokers is so staggering that the idea that TikTok is somehow has some special access to data, it strikes me as being just implausible. And I don't think the evidence is there. And I also don't think that shutting down TikTok was necessary. TikTok was in the process of doing something called Project Texas, where it was committing to storing all of its US user data in servers in Texas controlled by Oracle, a US company, which is dominated by Larry Ellison, a close friend of President Trump. And that, in our view, if insofar as there were data concerns, that would solve the concerns. And our concern here, of course, is not even so much for TikTok, is for the 170 million American users that use TikTok. I mean, to give you a story that is brand new, last night I was driven from Detroit Airport to here. I was chatting with the driver. He's a TikTok content provider, and he has a regular channel. He's got tens of thousands of followers. He provides some income out of it, gets income out of it. He's got a particular niche. It's actually a serious niche. It's not mild entertainment. And his view is, I could try to migrate to other things like YouTube, but TikTok is dominant in a way that it's very hard for me to do that. And there's, that millions of Americans are facing this dilemma, and that's kind of our concern.
So what do you think is the future now of TikTok? I mean, and I know there's a rumor maybe Oracle might be interested in buying
Also,
it.
yeah.
But why aren't all these social media companies interested in buying it? Because it seems like the algorithm has something really special that they can't seem to recreate.
Well, that's first of all, I mean, no one is talking about this, but I mean, there was talk about Elon Musk buying it. That's a horizontal merger. He already controls X. I mean, I practiced a little bit of antitrust law in my youth, and all of the alarms go off, right? I mean, similarly, Mark Zuckerberg, I mean, Reels, which is an Instagram feature, is the primary competitor to TikTok. So those people shouldn't be allowed near it because that sector has antitrust concerns already. But the problem, and again, this is all behind closed doors. I don't have any special access. But having read the law, as I see it, there are two prohibitions that seem to me really hard to get over. One, ByteDance cannot own more than 20% of TikTok. The other ownership needs to be American. So there was talk about a joint venture earlier. I don't see how that complies with the law. Two, TikTok, in whatever form it emerges, cannot use ByteDance's algorithm anymore. That's quite clear. But that's the whole point, right? The whole thing that makes TikTok special is the algorithm, that the Reels can go up on any platform.
Right.
So I don't see how TikTok comes out of this looking like TikTok. There might be some entity that has that name, but I don't see how it resembles. And maybe I'm wrong, like I said, there may be machinations. And of course, the law can always be amended. But given how strong its support was, and given that people like Senator Tom Cotton, so Republican, is actively opposing President Trump's current initiatives, it's hard for me to see how TikTok stays open in 3 months. I hope I'm wrong, but.
All right, TikTok users out there, take note. All right, beyond national security and data privacy concerns, right, there's a lot of anxiety from both ends of the political spectrum with how social media moderates content. So from the right, there's this concern that's expressed that they're silencing conservative voices. From the left, there's the concern that they're allowing misinformation on the platforms and even perhaps allowing for coordinated influence campaigns like the Chinese or that you were mentioning before or from Russia. And so as a result, these First Amendment cases are starting to grow involving social media before the Supreme Court. And last June, the Supreme Court decided the net choice cases, which for the first time seriously considered what the First Amendment rights of these social media companies were. So can you tell us a little bit about those cases and what was going on and how the Supreme Court approached the idea of First Amendment rights for social media companies?
Sure. So the net choice cases arose basically out of challenges to, and net choice is the industry group for the large platforms. So it arose out of challenges to the Florida and Texas laws that were passed in 2021 that directly regulate content moderation practices. The Florida law is a little strange, but it basically gives special protections to content by or about political candidates. It's a little self-serving, the legislature, but and journalistic enterprises. Though the term journalistic enterprises is defined in such broad terms that one of the lower courts pointed out, Pornhub qualifies as a journalistic enterprise under Florida's definition.
So this is the attack from the right, the concern from the right.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
And it's about concerns like the deplatforming of President Trump is what drove that. Texas actually adopted a much cleaner law in which it basically said, you cannot, in engaging in content moderation, you cannot engage in viewpoint discrimination based either on the viewpoint of the posts or the viewpoint of the user. And that law strikes me, the Florida law is odd. The Texas law strikes me as being getting at the heart of the problem because it's directly meant to address alleged anti-conservative bias on the platforms. Supreme Court took the cases, the lower court split, 11th and 5th Circuit split. They took the cases. Ultimately, they remanded because the industry chose to bring a facial challenge, and the court correctly said this is madness. Social media have a million different elements. They do many, many different things from messaging, feeds, and other stuff. And a facial challenge needs to address all those applications, and you haven't done so, so remand. But then Justice Kagan's majority opinion, partially for 6, but definitely all of the way for 5 justices, went on and said, but we want to make one thing clear, because 5th Circuit, you got this dead wrong. Insofar as what you are regulating is the feed function of, say, Facebook, or the homepage function of YouTube, and the same would be true of the recommendation algorithm for TikTok. TikTok wasn't a litigant, but that is protected by the First Amendment. Absolutely, the choices of what to promote, what not to promote, and what to block are First Amendment protected editorial choices, pointing to cases going back to the Tornillo case dealing with newspapers. And the court went on to say, insofar as Texas, you have said that your reason for regulating is to try and even out discourse on platforms, that is not a legitimate governmental interest. The government has no business balancing out or controlling the shape of public discourse. And those 2 statements, which there's a huge debate right now about whether that's dictum or holding. I think it's holding. Other people say it's dictum. I think it doesn't matter because it's a statement for 5 Supreme Court justices about what they're going to do in the future. So, it's a angels dancing on pinheads kind of stuff. Right. But it does signal that there's certain kinds of regulations that I think are out of bounds. And for example, the Texas statute would certainly be struck down if Facebook brought a as-applied challenge to it regarding its feed or YouTube and its homepage. There's no ambiguity about that. The court said so. So that at least provides some clarity, because the great fight was over, are social media platforms more like common carriers, more like telephone companies, which are required to carry all materials, and we don't, and we agree that does not implicate the First Amendment, or are they more like newspapers? And at least with respect to the feed functions, a majority of the court picked the newspaper analogy. And that's the significance, I think, of the case. I would add, it should be obvious to everyone, of course, that these functions are neither newspapers nor telephone systems, because they're not like telephone systems, because social media is utterly useless if it just carries everything through transparently. You would be buried in garbage like that. They have to moderate content. In many ways, people who observe the industry say that's what they're selling, is in fact choosing what to serve up to make people. And this is, going back to our TikTok, the algorithm is in fact the core of what they're selling. On the other hand, they're not like newspapers because it's third-party content. It's not their own content primarily. So I think the analogy is going to have to be tweaked. This is what's interesting about new technology is it's never perfectly analogous to anything. But first step, we know that it's going to be more like a newspaper than like telephone companies, and I agree with that. I think that's right.
Yeah. So in terms of moderation, another thing that happened recently is Meta decided that they were going to stop fact-checking. So at least in terms of their algorithm, how they're selecting content, it's not going to involve fact-checking, or so they say. Yeah. So why do you think Meta made that decision, and what do you think is going to be the consequences of that?
So complicated. So the cynic would say that this is just Mark Zuckerberg yielding to conservative critiques. And it's simply, now that President Trump has been re-inaugurated, kind of being in good graces with the new administration. And that may well be true. But I actually believe it's the right thing to do. I have long been a critic of fact-checking by social media. I've been especially harsh with members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress primarily, who've been trying to push social media to engage in fact-checking. I don't think they're very good at it. I think they have neither the expertise. First of all, I think the task is impossible. I mean, people just don't understand. They analogize it to newspapers, but the volume of posts on social media is so enormous that fact-checking it is just, it's even in the world of AI, is an enormous burden. And especially when it's things like falsehoods about private individuals, that's not stuff that's easy to check. But even like political falsehoods and things like that, it's very difficult to do, especially when it's very difficult in spaces what people care most about to know what the truth is. I mean, and I'm going to give you an example of where, under pressure from the Biden administration, early on in the COVID lockdowns, the theory that COVID-19 came from a lab leak in Wuhan was being labeled as misinformation and blocked. I read in the newspaper yesterday that the CIA now thinks that's more likely than not. Very low probability, and we'll never know, and I have no idea what the truth is. But I want you, the idea that something that was labeled misinformation 4 years ago is now the CIA's leading theory is a pretty good indicator of what the problem is. And I think this, if you're going to give Zuckerberg and his team credit for kind of a conscience, I think what he's reacting to, and I do think there's some truth to this, is a sense that we just in the last 5 years, we kind of lost our way a little bit. This idea that you have, under pressure from the government, you have these groups deciding what is allowed into the public discourse and what is not, is really problematic. The Hunter Biden laptop story, I mean, there are many examples. And I think that if you give them credit for what they're saying, and this is the way Zuckerberg put it, is we are blocking way too much stuff. We know our error rates are high. We don't know how high, but we know they're high, certainly more than 10%. And we're going to replace this kind of wall with an approach that X uses, which is have the community put notes on it indicating this might not be true, but let people make up their own mind.
So their error rates are high, though maybe not as high as the CIA, as we've learned over the last few decades. But okay, so I hear that. I mean, there's a lot of data out there, and probably a lot of false information too,
Yes.
and ambiguous stuff. But let me just kind of push back from some of this. But some of that false information involves kind of like very critical and clear false information. I think clear. Some of the critics from the left say, there's all this misinformation about vaccines and what they're causing. So some of it seems very important and some of it clear. So what do you say to those people who insist that they should police it to some extent, the accuracy of this information? And are there other tools like these flags, and do they work?
So here's what the data shows. And again, it's very preliminary, but the data suggests that very few people who weren't already convinced or are seeking out misinformation get confused by misinformation. It's the users that are the problem.
They're feeding them the information they want.
They're seeking out their own to confirm their own biases. And the idea that somehow someone who believed in vaccines yesterday reads something on Facebook and says, I was wrong, and RFK Jr. was right the whole time, that's a very rare phenomenon. It's really about confirming your own pre-existing beliefs. And again, this is true on both sides. So that's one response. And the difficulty becomes, even the vaccine skepticism stuff, you have to be really careful, right? Because some of the things vaccine skeptics say, and I'm not a vaccine skeptic to be very clear, but some of the things they say are not without basis, in fact. And the details of it are beyond me, because my daughter's in medical. She assures me, and she's not a vaccine skeptic either, that some of the things there about further research is needed, they're not necessarily wrong. So drawing those lines, again, becomes very, very, on the other hand, vaccines cause autism, clearly wrong, data shows it. Drawing those lines is difficult, and normally we don't, in our country, we don't draw those lines on behalf of people. And one of the most important tools for responding to bad speech is government speech. The government should be out there actively pushing the truth. Part of the problem we have is there are parts of our society, particularly today on the political right, it used to be on the political left, that are more skeptical about governmental institutions like the CDC. And I think that rebuilding that trust is actually really important. I think part of it is the back and forth during the COVID lockdowns really hurt confidence. And I think that the solution to misinformation is primarily to work really hard to try and reestablish trust in these institutions and have them be extremely nonpartisan in ways that I don't have a lot of great faith for the next 5 to 8 years, but I think in the long term that's more important, honestly.
Yeah. So more government speech, but less partisan, perhaps,
Yeah.
government speech.
Yes.
Well, so let's talk about government speech, where that's headed in the next 4 years, which you, as said, are not very confident about. Last week, we saw a new president inaugurated.
Yep.
A lot of tech billionaires in Washington.
Yep.
His new friends have been cozying up to the administration since the election, but one tech billionaire who's always been there is Elon Musk, right? He was all in for a long time ago. And he's been tasked with leading the new imagined Department of Government Efficiency,
Yeah.
which I understand is going to be in a technology office in the White House. And of course, Elon Musk also bought and renamed Twitter, turning it into X. So does that give you any concerns about having this person, very close ally of the president, in charge of perhaps some of the government speech and the speech from X? And how do you see X evolving with this new relationship?
So, lots to say about that.
Yeah.
One, I think conservative concerns about pro-left bias on social media, given that Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg were up there on that stage, I don't think their concerns are so serious anymore, right? I mean, it's clear that the platforms, that's just not going to be an issue going forward. Because remember, Zuckerberg himself controls not just Facebook, but also Instagram. So, I mean, that's a big deal. So I don't, and TikTok is also clearly buttering up to the administration for obvious reasons. So I think those concerns are gone. But it's complicated because there's also been a push for users away from X since Musk took over. And basically what Musk did is after he took over Twitter, he fired a huge percentage of the content moderation team at Twitter. So there's much, much less content moderation now than there was. And the result has been fairly dramatically terrible for the business model because advertisers fled in droves in response because there's a lot more hate speech and things like that on the platform, which is protected by the First Amendment, to be clear. But you don't, as an advertiser, you don't want your ad to show up next to something that's going to repulse people. I mean, it's called brand safety, is the term within the advertising industry. And so there's a huge amount of revenue has fled from Twitter, and I think that Mark Zuckerberg is going to have to face the same issues with his own platforms. One thing to note about Zuckerberg is, he talks about being pro-free speech, and it was more so before 2016. But there's always been aggressive content moderation on Facebook and Instagram. For example, bans on nudity the whole time. Because Zuckerberg has always been aware of this business concern, that you need to have a platform that is safe for advertisers, right? And this is a business that he essentially built. Well, Elon Musk is a newcomer. And Elon Musk he's a brilliant engineer. I mean, that's no question, but this is not his sweet spot. And so I don't know how it's going to evolve, but here's what I think is going to happen. And if I knew what was going to happen, I'd be rich, so don't take it from me. But I think social media is going to shatter. I think what you're going to see is some platforms becoming dominantly right, like X, other platforms becoming dominantly left. What I see on my feed is a lot of people fleeing X and now even Facebook with Zuckerberg's turn, and going to, for example, Blue Sky, which seems to be the haven for progressives right now. And I think that is going to accelerate, I think inevitably, because people are looking for very different experiences on social media. I think there's some real downsides to this. Greater polarization, greater silos, things like that. On the other hand, I always have to remind people that until the 20th century, the press in this country was always highly partisan. This idea of kind of the newspapers being politically neutral, that's a 20th century invention. That was really I think it was the 1920s, journalists kind of adopted objectivity as their model. But if you look at from the framing period through the Civil War, newspapers were explicitly linked to political parties. They were not, they were not owned by the parties, but it's clear they had ties to the parties. And so a partisan press and that kind of division is not a new thing. It's the 20th century that was sort of the aberration. And I would say in the 21st century, Fox News was launched in 1996, just the eve of the 21st century. That's going away. We're going back to the old normal. And that has good upsides, it has downsides, but I don't think, if I had to predict what's going to happen, I think that's what's going to happen.
Okay. Let me, one last area I want to cover before we opening up to questions is, besides the critiques, kind of the political critiques from the left and the right and the national security concerns, a consistent bipartisan critique of social media involves just the technology itself, the way the algorithms work, and particularly on children, having kind of a negative or harmful effect on users and to children in particular. So what do you think about those criticisms, and is there any appropriate role for the law, if there is anything to them, to address that?
So this is the one area where I think the answer is maybe. I'm usually very hostile towards regulations of social media or any media or free speech. But here it's complicated. I am deeply unconvinced that the evidence is there that things like, there is definitely a mental health crisis among adolescents in this country. Though, as we were talking about earlier, it's hard to know whether there's actually an increase or whether it's simply that the stigma attached to mental health issues has gone down and so people are willing to come forward. To what extent social media can be tied to this is very hard to say. Because while there is some correlation between mental health issues among adolescents and their social media use, the causation could easily go in the opposite direction, where it's people who are having trouble, who are spending more time online. You could easily see how that would be true. Especially sort of vulnerable youth, like LGBTQ youth, often find groups online that are difficult to find sort of in the physical world. So maybe there's something there, maybe there's not. What I do know is that the extreme suggestions, like Senator Hawley, Josh Hawley's suggestion that we just ban social media for under 16, this is not the way you raise children, is to cut them off from technology, plus good luck. But that's it's a bad idea. I'm also very suspicious anytime a government actor decides this is what children need. I don't think that's their role. But I think there are ways forward to come up with legislative tools that empower parents more than currently parents are empowered. To make it easier for parents to do things like, actually something simple, like simply have parents have access. This is Kate Silva, Professor BU has proposed this. Have a tool whereby parents can create a curfew, where the media platform has to cut off the kid's feed at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. I'm fine with that. It seems to me that's a good thing. Parents can choose to do it or not to do it, depending on. There are some concerns there, especially for vulnerable kids. But still, by and large, we in our society, parents raise their children. That's fine. And so, yeah, there is room there, but we need to tread cautiously because, as it is, control over public schools gives the government many opportunities to indoctrinate children. And by indoctrinate, and the line between education and indoctrination we all know is a very thin one. To spread that power to private media concerns me a lot, just because that's not the relation between state and citizens that should exist in a democracy. But yeah, there is some room there for sure. I think that parents sometimes feel completely disempowered in this field, and helping them out would be good.
Yeah. All right, let me just pause to see if we have any questions from the audience. Do we have any? Yes, I have one in the back.
Hi. My name's Sadie, and I just had a question regarding when we were discussing the TikTok algorithm and kind of the influence of Oracle and the buttering up to Trump's presidency. So I think my misunderstanding is, how is it, like, okay, once TikTok came back online after going dark, right? It had like a little message like thanks to President Trump, TikTok's back.
Yeah.
And then once the app was back, it automatically followed certain accounts like Facebook and Instagram and Trump and JD bans for all TikTok users.
Is that right?
And so there are things like that that make me question, how is that not a violation in like swaying the narrative of the algorithm in a certain way to like bias it in favor of the government? Because as you said, like the initial issue I think was that there was a lot of sentiment against the government because of the pro-Palestinian like content that was coming up on our feed. So it's like, how is it not a violation of our, like expression if it's swaying the algorithm in a certain way?
So I believe you that happened. I was not aware of that, but there are other things that are definitely good. I mean, the reason it's not a violation is because the First Amendment doesn't govern TikTok, right? It's a private actor, not a state actor. So under net choice, TikTok has a right to manipulate its algorithm in ways that it wants. And if they're manipulating it in ways that are benefiting the current administration, that would not surprise me at all, right? Because and it's not as if other media do not do that under other circumstances as well. You read the New York Times editorial page, they're clearly not neutral. So I think that's within their right. I wish they were more transparent about it, but I want to draw a distinction. So Oracle is working with TikTok to store US user data. The algorithm is coming out of China. The algorithm is, and it's ByteDance controls the algorithm. TikTok has a little bit of control over it over the edges, but it's basically a ByteDance algorithm is the way I understand it. And that's precisely what TikTok has been saying is the problem, is that ByteDance is not willing to give up control over the algorithm because they use it worldwide. So why would they possibly do that? The US market is tiny. It's not tiny, but it's not nearly the whole market. And what they're doing with it is and this is true with all the algorithms, they're very opaque, right? It's very hard to know what Facebook is doing with its algorithm because they change it constantly. I mean, in the last 5 years, Mark Zuckerberg has gone to people love news, no, people want more personal content, no, people want more commercial content, and most recently, no, people actually love news. Right? Those are all changes that are happening on the Facebook and Instagram algorithms that are being driven by many different factors. And TikTok is doing the same thing is what my perception is. But what's fascinating about this is that after President Trump issued his executive orders, the question was, are companies going to work with TikTok again? Bearing in mind that they would be subject to tens of billions of dollars of fines under the text of the statute if his orders were ever found to be invalid. And the big one is the suspension for 90 days. So if you were a lawyer and your company, if you're the boss of Oracle, the boss of Apple, the boss of Google comes to you and says, do we work with TikTok again? Do we allow the app back on the store? Do we allow them to use our servers? What's the right move? So what I suspected happened, and the New York Times confirmed 2 days ago, was Apple and Google said no, not taking the risk. So you still can't download the app. Oracle said, yes, we're going to take the risk. We don't think it's that big. And therefore, that's why TikTok came back up, is Oracle was willing to allow use of their service again. Amazon, which had been providing services to TikTok, said no, we're not going to take the risk. So it's a fascinating example of the role of lawyers and risk in this area, right?
Yeah. Diana?
The algorithm, do you think there's any specific tools that the government or other actors could use to even try and discern whether there's viewpoint discrimination? Because a lot of legislators don't even understand the technology. And as well as, is it just going to balance itself out with different companies navigating the markets in different ways?
First of all, the second is definitely true. And we're already seeing it, right? I mean, for a while, there was a huge divergence between the meta companies, which is Facebook and Instagram, and X. Though there's now some convergence. It's hard to know because what the studies I've read suggest that conservatives actually are better at using social media than progressives, like substantially so. But the problem also becomes that if you look at some of the policies that continue to be in place, such as policies against hate speech, and this is no longer in place, but policies against vaccine disinformation on these platforms during the pandemic, they unquestionably disproportionately affected voices from the political right. But of course, the reason, especially the hate speech policies, the reasons those were adopted long predates any of the current debates, long predates the 2016 election. It's simply about brand safety and basically wanting to not drive away advertisers. So to what extent there is, on the other hand, I will also concede that given that these companies tend to be located in the Bay Area where I live, of course their employees are disproportionately on the political left. I mean, it's like San Francisco's liberal news. So it's really hard to know. I don't even know how I would design that study, because you have to figure out how to label boasts. And then things like vaccine skepticism, we now think of that as a right-wing phenomenon. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. comes from the left originally. Think about his last name, right? I mean, that's just a position where how you label that on the political spectrum, I have no idea. So I don't think we will ever know. But I think if I'm right that we're going to see more splintering of social media space, I think what we're going to find is some platforms with very loose content moderation policies already exist, things like Parler. And on the other hand, some with policies that look more like Facebook 2 years ago.
If I could follow up on that, how does, and you mentioned earlier the European Union regulation, and how do other regulatory actors impact that splitting and that change that you see? Because also, the European Union famously has much more of an appetite for regulation of speech. So could maybe just comment on kind of what they're doing and how that might impact this.
So the European Union, most importantly for this space, adopted the Digital Services Act, DSA, went into effect 2022, I think. Polar opposite from the US approach. So and this built on a 2018 German law called NetzDG that basically said, if there is hate speech on your platform, and once you've been notified, you don't pull it down, we're going to fine you into oblivion. And the DSA makes that basically a EU-wide approach. And it has similar rules about hate speech is their big target, but they have similar rules about disinformation and a whole bunch of other things as well. Privacy rules, blah, blah, blah. First of all, in the US, that would be unconstitutional because hate speech is protected speech, disinformation is protected speech, I mean, it's all of that stuff. But it also is, the European approach troubles me deeply because it creates lots of mechanisms whereby if you don't like something and you flag it, if I'm a social media platform and someone comes to me and says, this is hate speech, and you look at it and say, but let me pick. I take it down. Leave it up, potentially $100 million in fines. What am I going to do? I'm going to just take it down, right? Always. Why would I possibly mess with that? And so I think that is a real concern, is over-moderation, and that the experience with NetzDG, that's why I mentioned it, is we actually do have some data with that, the DSA is too recent, is that there was definitely over-moderation. The other thing about the European Union is they've created this program where there are these groups called trusted, I can't remember the exact statutory language, and of course it's in a billion different languages, it's the EU, but something like trusted flaggers. They're organizations that the government can designate as trusted flaggers, and if they flag stuff, basically you have to pay attention to it or you're in big trouble. Well, who is Viktor Orban's government in Hungary going to appoint as trusted flaggers? And not all EU governments are equally liberal. Then we're heading clearly in a different unit. If the Le Penists win the presidency in France, how is that going to work? The EU is to me is a model of why the government should not regulate speech, because I think they do it extraordinarily poorly. And of course, there's also this weird phenomenon where the EU has no tech companies. Spotify is the only one really, and so all their regulation is directed at American companies. So the economic costs of it, they don't internalize in any way. Ireland does, because all those companies, their European locations are in Ireland. But otherwise, there's no downside, right? If it was something like fossil fuel emissions, Germany would be squawking because they've got an auto industry. But there's no one sort of on the other side on the EU debate. And it's not just the EU. I mean, part of it is when the EU adopts approaches, they're often copied by other regimes around the world, some of which are less savory. But the EU model can provide a model of how you suppress speech. And we see this phenomenon going on as well. In India, which is in between, of course, because it's a democracy, but the Modi government has been accused of using tools under India's IT laws to, again, put heavy pressure on tech companies to suppress content they don't like. And that's not good, right? That's not, I mean, and sometimes I'm sure it's a legitimate use. Like India has much stricter public morality rules than the EU or the US. But you can also see how it could be politically misused quite easily.
So if these are all American companies, then will we see different versions of them in these different jurisdictions, you think, in terms of speech?
We already are,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so if the Texas law had ever gone into effect as the Fifth Circuit wanted it to, I want you to note, in Europe, it's illegal to allow hate speech to remain on the platform. In Texas, it was illegal to remove hate speech because hate speech is a viewpoint. Supreme Court has said so multiple times. So literally, you have to have polar opposite platforms on this, right? So yes, that we're clearly seeing this. We're going to see more of it. It's too bad because one of the great things about the internet was it was an open space for everybody. Well, not China, but other than China, that's going to change. I think we're going to see much more walled gardens with interoperability, but still, which is kind of contrary to the early kind of optimism about the internet. But yes, they have to do it. They don't have a choice. And they've always done it in some sense. They've always said, we have to follow local law because especially many countries, and there was this huge blow up in Brazil over X, there was a blow up in India. Many countries insist that the platforms have local executives in residence in those countries who are subject to potential criminal prosecution if they don't follow local rules. So the platforms have been, essentially it's a legal hostage thing, right? But the platforms therefore have had to follow local rules, which are different, sharply different across the world.
Yeah, other questions in the audience? Did you have?
Glenn.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really interesting and informative talk. I really agree with your suggestion that it's important for us to work on reestablishing trust in government. I'm curious though if you have suggestions about how to do that in a context when anti-government and anti-regulatory speech is so prevalent and there's no limitation on like false information or misinformation. And my thought is it's much easier to tear something down than build something up. So how do we reinstill confidence in government regulation?
So I don't think we'll ever reinstill confidence in government regulation, not in the short term anyway, because the loss of faith in government is not limited to this space, right? It covers, if you think about economic policy, foreign policy, there's a huge distrust of elites in this country on all sorts of issues like that, and in my opinion, for good reason. So that's a long-term project. I actually think in my heart that the government has a limited role to play here. I actually think maybe as providing seed money and the like, but I actually think the model for how we can reestablish faith in fact-checking and information providers is more on the Wikipedia model than on the top-down model. It's not that people like the CDC will not have a role to play. I think they will necessarily. But I think it would also be good if we had sources of information that were bipartisan, that were run on a nonprofit basis, that truly did represent a range of people, of experts, but not just the left, right? The difficulty becomes, the academy in particular has a serious problem with people on the right not trusting it because of the fact that the academy is so overwhelmingly progressive in its politics. And so this is something it's very early on. I think this is my next research project. But I feel like there should be some way to create institutions that are more trusted than anything that exists currently. But how to do that? I think in the short term, and it's not going to happen anytime extremely soon, but I think entities like the CDC, I'm using that as an example, but you can imagine lots of others. They need to have no regulatory power, because once you mix regulatory power with speech, it becomes very fraught. And they need to have, or very limited regulatory power. And they need to have lots of layers of protection from basically political influence. And now I also fear, I teach administrative law, and that hat tells me the Supreme Court would strike that down. But I think it would be wrong to do so.
All right. Well, on that note, we have our work cut out for us. So what a great discussion. We certainly haven't covered everything, but we're out of time, unfortunately. Ash can stick around for a bit if you have some burning questions, but please join me in thanking him for coming to Michigan State University.
Thank you for having me. This was fascinating.
Thank you. And our next Dean speaker and last of the year will be Professor Danielle Citron from the University of Virginia, and she'll join us on Monday, March 10th for a discussion of privacy, free expression, and civil rights in a digital age. So another look at free speech in the digital age. Hope you can join us for that conversation, and have a great day. Thank you for coming.